So I want to thank everybody for joining us. We are glad you're here, but I also want to remind everyone to keep themselves muted during the talk. I'm your host, Mac Marquis. I'm a PhD candidate at William & Mary, and these talks are brought to you every month by LAWCHA, the Labor and Working Class History Association. For those of you who are not yet LAWCHA members, please consider joining. I'll post a link to that in the chat box shortly. We have some great talks lined up through December. On January 22nd, we'll be joined by Alice L. Baumgartner, and she'll be discussing her latest book, South to Freedom, Runaway Slaves to Mexico and the Road to the Civil War. I will also post a link to this and the rest of our upcoming talks in the chat box momentarily. Tonight, we are joined by Ronald W. Shatz. Dr. Shatz will be discussing his recent book, The Labor Board Crew, Remaking Worker-Employer Relations from Pearl Harbor to the Reagan Era. Dr. Shatz will be talking for about a half an hour, and then we're going to open the floor to Q&A. So for folks who are not familiar with how we do things at these talks, please post your questions for the Q&A in the chat box, and I will call on you and ask you to unmute and ask your question, and then mute yourself after you ask your question, and Ron will go ahead and answer your question. And at this point, I want to turn the floor over to Ron. Ron?
Great, thank you, thank you. This is a book that's been many years in the making, and it's a complex story of some people who, a handful of people who I think had a key points in modern American labor history, and not only that, U.S. history and even world history. So let me begin, and I'll give a quick overview about this, and then leave interpretation issues open to you and questions about it. So let's begin with this first slide. Oh, that's the book cover. Let's go to the first slide. This is Will Davis and George W. Taylor, the chair and vice chair of the National Labor Board. The board was established by President Franklin Roosevelt in January 1942. After Pearl Harbor was attacked, the United States was confronted with attack in the United States, but equally importantly, was challenged by the Axis powers around the world. And the only way that the US and its allies could defeat Germany, Italy, and Japan was with, amongst other things, US industry. But the problem, of course, as you know, is that unions and management were very at sharp odds. And moreover, there was only in a couple of industries, railroads and the garment industries, where there were systems for how to resolve these conflicts. So this new board, which consisted of 12 members, 4 from major industries, corporations, 4 from top labor unions, and 4 representatives supposedly of the public. Though these are all basically extremely experienced arbitrators. It was urgent that they had to succeed for the United States and its allies to win, and they did so. I mean, at Tehran, Joseph Stalin raised a toast to Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill to American industry, without whom we could not have succeeded. That said, however, the board at its very first meeting decided that they themselves could not resolve this thing. They needed scores, ultimately, as it turned out, several hundred young economists and lawyers who would they serve as to mediate, arbitrate, and resolve conflicts at the local level. Move on, please. One example, next on, please, is Clark Kerr, who in this picture here is a junior in college at Swarthmore College. He was first in his class. He was, it's worth noting, convinced that as a converted Quaker, many of the people who CIO director, President Phil Murray called the labor board boys, because they were so young, and yet they had so much influence in American industry during the war and indeed afterwards. Murray Kerr was a peace activist, anti-war from the beginning. In college, he debated with Norman Thomas over whether socialism was or could succeed, and Kerr was more radical than Thomas in that debate. He became involved with labor issues in his research as a master's student and a graduate student with farm laborers in California. And then, like so many others, ultimately about 250 of them, but I'm concentrating in the book about the top 10 or 12 or 15 who are most influential, became staff for the War Labor Board, doing the dirt, doing the hard work at the ground level. Let's go on, please. One example, another example is Gene McKelvey. Gene McKelvey, there were other, I should say, the War Labor Board staff were, or by staff, I mean, in some cases they were officers, but at the local level, at the regional level. Ultimately, some of them were put on the national board. Of those 250, only 6 were women. Of those 6, only Gene McKelvey had a lifelong career in the field. So I interviewed her several times, and also another woman who was who was on the board. But McKelvey is very interesting, not least because she is one of the first people for the Cornell ILR school. At Cornell, they not only created a law school, you know, and a medical school, but an entire college with PhDs and masters and BAs in labor and management relations to train them throughout the state. And Gene McKelvey would travel. She not only taught in college and for the students, she did research, but she also went around the state, as they all did actually for the faculty in those days, mediating and teaching how to resolve conflicts, teaching to union people, and more. Let's go on, please. Another one of these labor board vets was John Dunlop, here as a young assistant or associate professor at Harvard. His job during the war and after the war, first and foremost, was to mediate in the construction industry. I could talk more about what else he did, but that was the single most important thing he did until the 70s. Let's go on to the next one, please, is Sylvester Garrett. Sylvester Garrett, during the war, was in charge of the Pennsylvania and the surrounding region during the war. After the war, he became the principal intermediary for U.S. Steel and the U.S. Steel and the Steelworkers Union. In this picture, it's the 1962 New York newspaper strike, which shut down the whole newspapers in New York City, and it was an automation strike. But Garrett is really worth understanding. A ruling that he made in 1959 prompted the 1959 strike, almost 3 months long, the biggest strike in American history. And yet he also, the war, or after that strike, he also worked between both sides to overcome the conflicts, and ultimately led to, as you know, the no strike pledge, cooperation between the two in 73. More about that if you like. Let's go on next, please. These people were at the center of unions and management issues after the war, during the war, after the war in the 50s and in the 1950s. There were also, I could talk about that, but I don't have time at this moment, what they were doing overseas. But when the student uprising began, and this is Mario Savio, who was being grabbed by campus police as he's trying to speak at the Greek Theater in December '64. When the student uprising began, that's mostly with the Vietnam War and US involvement. So 67, 68, 69, even 66. But even, but the leading universities, public and private in the United States, almost all of them appointed labor board vets, the labor board boys, as their presidents or their provosts or their top deans, reasoning, gee, they handle the unions, they handle management, surely they can handle, they'd be good with the students. Well, as you know, next slide, please. Clark Kerr, who had that position even earlier, he was, at this point, he was president of the University of California. He was appointed as the provost at Berkeley in the early 50s. Clark Kerr utterly mangled, utterly handled the free speech movement completely dreadfully from their point of view. Ultimately, as soon as Ronald Reagan became governor of California in January of '67, he immediately fired Clark Kerr. He offered Kerr the opportunity to resign. Kerr said no. I could go on about that story. But next slide, please. Kerr is just one example. Another one who was far more successful was Robin Fleming. This photo here, it's in the midst of, at 3 a.m. in the morning. He's meeting with the leaders of the Black student movement. And the question is, well, how are we handling the strike that's happening on the campus? And the white students running through the library, damaging property. And Robin Fleming said, what are going to do? I'll tell you what story, how it happens. But Robin Fleming was first the provost at Madison, and then president at Ann Arbor. And he not only succeeded, through luck, but also skill in keeping, you don't know about Columbia and Harvard and Madison and Berkeley and others can't stay. But Ann Arbor, where SDS started, remained, comparatively speaking, quite calm. And Fleming deserves much of the credit, if you want to call it credit. Moreover, he was connected to university administrators throughout the country. And he and they did, but particularly several of the World Labor Board vets who became university administrators developed a system for conflict resolution, which all of us have at our universities. Students have a protest. Well, I could go on how they, but the systems are evolved there, and which are essentially modeled on what these guys were doing during the war and after the war. In grievance and arbitration systems. Student protests since then, but nothing. Scale. Let's go on, please. Next slide, please. But this wasn't all that they were doing. This book is not only about what they did in what we might call the old industries. The beginning in the early to mid 60s, public employees, first and foremost, but not in New York City, began to strike. First, the transit workers, who shut down the boroughs completely for almost 12 days. Here you see the workers coming to work then by walking and bikes so they could get to work from the outer boroughs. Once again, it's these folks, in this case, a committee of 4, chaired by George W. Taylor, the chairman of the World Labor Board, along with Dunlop and David Cole and 2 others, who suggested, appointed by Governor Rockefeller, developed a proposed legislation, which was revised but adopted by the New York State Legislature, and then revised again after more strikes, because strikes were extremely common and ferocious in the late 60s in New York. But the Taylor Committee and what they called the Taylor Law, ultimately, but it took a long time to bring that kind of peace there too. And their system was adopted willy-nilly in one unionized state after another, from Wisconsin to California, Michigan, and others. So, white collar workers. Next slide, please. But it's in the late 60s and early 70s, these guys were not only in that kind of stuff. Another industry, which was unionized in the mid to late 60s and early 70s, was professional sports. Here we see Reggie Jackson, the star for the New York Yankees, and Marvin Miller, formerly the chief economist for the steelworkers, but he then became executive director of the Major League Baseball Players Association. And Marvin Miller, veterans of the league say, did more than anything. You know something about the incomes and the salary and the benefits which professional athletes have afterwards. It was pitiful before that. And in this case, this photo is just on the eve of the first baseball strike. And rather like Gene Debs, Miller didn't think the strike would work out and just urged against it, but they went ahead anyhow and they succeeded. But it's not only Miller. How did they do it? They had arbitration introduced in baseball, basketball, American football. They transformed those industries. So again, there are these folks. Now, it might seem that these people are succeeding one place after another. Well, not necessarily. Move next slide, please. Well, we saw John Dunlop before when he was an assistant professor at Harvard. Now he's the senior professor and with the top chair and quit Gerald Ford. And shortly before that, he was director of the Cost of Living Council during the Nixon administration. His face, he had a powerful sort of personality with impact. In some ways, he was quite successful in his very, very brief term as Secretary of Labor, however. He was unable in the Nixon and Ford administration to do much of anything to quell inflation. I mean, inflation was one of the principal factors that undermined the system of labor management. Cooperation is not the right word, but systems of resolution. I mean, the labor boys, as I call them, they thought inflation was a good idea. Modest inflation was a good idea. They didn't imagine that could get out of hand. And when it did, well, Dunlop ultimately in January of 76, he resigned as Secretary of Labor. So so far as I know, one of the 2 or 3 cabinet secretaries that ever resigned on a matter of principle. One is James Bryan as Secretary of State under Wilson, and Dunlop because the President Ford backed off from his promise to support the Common Citus Act, which would have brought some sort of peace between unions and management in the construction industry. Now, to pause for a moment here. The Labor Board vets, since most of them were professors of economics or law or industrial relations at leading universities around the country. They had dozens and then scores and then several hundred graduate students, some of whom some of us may have studied with or met, but only one, let's go on the next slide, please, was as brilliant, as fervent in his convictions as they were, as thick-skinned and as influential as this graduate student from MIT named George Schultz. Here we see him, he was a Princeton graduate. Here we see him now as a Marine in the Pacific. After the war ended, he was, as a Marine officer captain, he was sent to Boston, but there wasn't much work for him. So he said to his commander, can I take classes at MIT during the daytime? I'll just come back to work at night. He said, sure, why not? Well, he earned a degree in economics with a concentration on industry and industrial relations, and then became an arbitrator and mediator and professor at MIT, and then at Chicago. Next slide, please. And in late 68, he's appointed by, asked by President-elect Nixon, would you please join my administration? And Dunlop agrees. Schultz, excuse me, thank you. Schultz agrees. But he not only does the usual normal things with industrial relations, because he was experienced at that already, but the key issues confronting the Nixon administration, one of them was integration of the public schools in the southern states. And Schultz chairs a committee which succeeded in working with leaders of the Black community and the white community in each of the major towns in the southern states, and peacefully, for the most part, there were exceptions, but for the most part, peacefully integrated the southern public schools. Now, we know qualifications of that. There's many white families withdrew. More to say about that. But hadn't been, Brown versus Board of Education had little impact until then. And Schultz was using the techniques of the War Labor Board, this time for that purpose. Another thing he did as Secretary of Labor was to lean on the steel industry and the construction industry, and then ultimately all American industries, including the universities, to begin introducing affirmative action. Affirmative action did not begin with the Democrats, it was the Republicans. Why, we could talk about. But again, it was Schultz. One last thing. This is the Labor Board boys' top protege. Next slide, please. And that is a Secretary of Labor, excuse me, a Secretary of State in the Reagan administration. Schultz negotiated with Secretary General Gorbachev and Foreign Minister Shevardnadze. In the meetings and the summits, which, as we know, brought an end, at least for a fair number of years, a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and even ultimately, as you know, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And Schultz, I mean, he wasn't doing it alone. He was following Reagan's desires, but he had to lean heavily because it confronted in sharp opposition inside the Reagan administration. But ultimately succeeded. But this, and this is ironic, really. Schultz is doing this with the techniques that he learned from his mentors. And he's doing it in American industries, now on the world stage. But in an administration which was determined to undermine unions, and which is, of course, we all know, fired air controllers. Well, with that, you can close the slides, please. And this is extraordinary small group of intermediaries who had impact beyond, beyond their what we normally consider and an impact beyond in the United States, around the world, in unions, in universities, higher education, the public schools, and more. Well, I've said nothing about impact, my interpretations, others, whatever your questions are, I'm ready. Thank you.
Okay, feel free to give Ron a hand or use your emojis to do so if you so choose. And we are now open for questions, and anyone who has a question, please feel free to post it in the chat, and then we'll ask you to unmute and you can ask your question to Ron directly.
Shall I call on people or not? I mean, I always use names. I don't see Jason.
I'll go ahead and once people post a question, I'll go ahead and ask them to unmute. But in the meantime, I'll exploit my role as host and ask you to, what do you see? Do you see the labor board voice as having a role in the expansion of business unionism, as far as creating a professional cadre of negotiators? And
Yes. I understand. Okay, yeah. I mean, business unionism goes back to the early 20th century, at least, or even earlier with the AFL. But yes, one of their principal objectives as intermediaries, for first in the what we call blue collar industries, or in the older industries, this is during the war itself, and especially during the labor management conference, which Harry Truman called in 1945, was to urge unions and management to have developed trained vice presidents for industrial relations and from union management, and that most need to, and to educate the supervisors and even the local level, the stewards and the foremen. That's what Gene McKelvey was doing in upstate New York, and dozens of these folks were doing. They did the same thing in the public employees, public sector in the 60s and the 70s. So yes, they were extremely important in having that. We get a relative. I don't need to say that there was no conflict. I mean, in fact, these guys themselves would fully acknowledge lots of conflict. They thought conflict was inevitable and even desirable, much as there is in ancient Greek theater, because it comes to the resolved. But they wanted to develop. That's also what they were doing in their schools. People went to ILR school at UC Berkeley, UCLA, at Madison, it was Illinois, and huge university, so forth. So yes.
We have another question. This one's coming from David Zonderman. David, may you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question directly?
Thanks. I'm a lousy typist, so I'd rather just ask it. I guess my question, Ron, is often the argument is made about the World War I labor board that even though they were disbanded right after the war, a lot of their policy ideas reached fruition in the New Deal. And I'm wondering if you could make a similar argument for the World War II board, that even though they disbanded after the war, were there key policies that sort of emerged later in, say, legislation? Or is your argument more it has to do with this sort of ethos of industrial relations and arbitration and contracts and things of that sort?
Well, thank you. Thank you, David. They had the same names. The War Labor Board the First World War and the Second World War. They also had 12 members. That said, the second one lasted for 3.5 years, not just 16 months. And it had a much larger staff. And it was the First World War, the first board had an impact, as you suggest, on the legislation for the Wagner Act, most importantly. But let's suppose hypothetically there hadn't been a Second World War, the conflicts between labor and management would have continued just as sharply. It was only with the Second War and this longer war, and of course the conflict with the Soviet Union, which international conflict facilitates cooperation domestically. And so the second board, I would argue, had more impact. Not only, I've suggested, in industry, although it did that, but also, for instance, in our universities, in public education, and ultimately in foreign affairs. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions that they would like to ask? Okay, we have one coming in hot off the boil from Eileen Boris. Eileen, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, if I have this right, and it's been a while since I've worked on seeing that era, but how did your boys, quote unquote, bring questions of equal pay by race and sex into the future? Or did they? The Westinghouse case, the Win Newman, who later was very active in the union movement as a lawyer, was quite late in the war. And some of these other issues of, there were obviously determinations, but war production took over as more important.
Yes.
So could you elaborate more on those issues of
so how they dealt with issues of
how they did and going into the future in their other work?
Yes, most definitely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, as you know, in fact, your major issues, I don't remember the title, that you and Nelson did about management of labor history, labor history since the 1920s forward, includes a ruling by the World Labor Board to facilitate, insist on equal pay for women workers. And it wasn't only because of that we think of the 1920s, the period, as economists call it, of the Great Compression, when differences in incomes and pay became narrowed during the war for the first and only time in U.S. history. Now, the World Labor Board was not solely responsible for that. It was first and foremost the new opportunities available for Black workers, brown workers, for women workers, for elderly, for handicapped, and many other workers during the war. But also the legislation and policies of the board itself were such to more narrowly to adjust more, adjust the pay, especially compensation for women workers, and especially. Now, the race issue is harder and more difficult. This board was exclusively white, and the group remained almost exclusively white. There were some members of the group who were particularly sensitive to racial discrimination. Most importantly in this regard was Jean McKelvey, who did a great deal of teaching of industrial relations and systems of conflict resolution to women at Cornell and the Black students at Cornell. William Gould, the Black labor chair of the National World Labor Board, was a protege of Jean McKelvey. On the other hand, Gould himself was very angry and displeased by John Dunlop, by Dunlop's work, because he worked so closely with the construction unions and the construction contractors, who were exclusively white. The first one in the group who was willing to confront the racial issues was their protege, George Schultz. He was. Even before he became Secretary of Labor, when he was appointed as the president chair of their organization, the Industrial Relations Research Association. This is in 1968, and conditions, after one after another of racial conflicts and violence in the streets. Dunlop said the unions and the contractors have been far too inadequate. Excuse me, I said Dunlop. I'm talking about. I meant to be saying Schultz, George Schultz. And then as Secretary of Labor, he did the same. It's there where it began in steel and construction, and then in all of our industries, including higher education. However, these people after the war were hired by the unions and hired by the companies. They worked for them, and they were repeatedly fired by them if they didn't satisfy their needs. So while some of them may have been liberally minded, even most of them have been liberally minded, for instance, Sylvester Garrett. Sylvester Garrett's wife was Molly Yard, the radical socialist president of the student socialist movement in the 30s, and later president twice of the National Organization for Women. Or Ted Keel, not member of the World Labor Board, who's becomes the chief mediator in New York City, was also president of the union of Urban League. But they worked for their employers. And so it took power from the state, which ultimately came, but not until later. Eileen, does that answer? I hope so.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And, there's a lot of reverberations into the future. That's for sure. We need a lot more research, of course, but it's a fascinating history. Did you use George Schultz's papers? Were they open to you?
Schultz's papers are at Hoover, and they're not open to anybody.
Yeah,
they're actually, that's not quite true. He chose his biographer
Hmm.
who also, if I'm not mistaken, is another Princeton alum. And that book is coming out within a few months. I was asked to read the draft. But
Who was that? Who's
I'm forgetting his name now. He was a New York Times foreign correspondent. I'm forgetting his name now.
yeah, because he's in something else I'm writing. I'm trying to see how he responded when he was Secretary of Labor to some hot seller rule making that was done under the previous administration.
So
And
Philip Taubman.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Phil Taubman. That's right.
I was just wondering if you had any experience with, dealing with the Hoover Institute about the Schultz papers now that he's passed.
No, the answer is no.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna have to deal with that. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, looks like we have a question from Toby.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Ron. This is super fascinating. I have a lot of different questions, and I am intrigued about how the labor board arbitrators thought about the more activist parts of the labor movement. But I want to ask a different question about that sort of connects the 30s to the 60s and the way these men were thinking about the working class and the role of the students of the 60s. They, I guess, saw themselves as moderating the more radical elements of the working class movement of the 1930s. Did they directly analogize? Did they see the students of the 1960s as workers of a kind? Or were they sort of, how did they imagine the structure of class society and where higher education fit into that? Were they kind of working with the new class theories or what? I'm just kind of intrigued if you could say more about how they analogized their interactions with the student organizers and leftists.
I don't want to, I could, if we had a little more time, I'd open up the book and turn to and quote Robin Fleming, but I shouldn't do that, I guess. Fleming he's not the only one who's doing this sort of work. They're all in one university after another, they're doing this kind of work. The president of the University of New Hampshire is particularly important in this regard, actually, his work. And he's originally from Cornell. That said, they weren't reading new class theory. These guys were very practical, pragmatic, non-theoretical, which is not to say they had no ideas. I think they were quite illogical, but it was not. In those days, such ideas were put aside, kept it quiet in the aftermath of Nazism and communism and the Holocaust. They were not talking about theory, about ideology. They thought, they aimed to try, they thought it was possible. Some of my other contemporaries here were involved in the student movement in the 60s, in the early 70s. And these people thought that it was possible to separate the bulk of the protesting students from the most violent ones. And that how to do it, you meet with them. You meet with them for hours on end. Meet with them like they did in steel and auto. If you need to, meet with them for 26 hours to reach compromises. Tell them what your bottom line is, what the trustees will give you, pretending now that you or I are the president of whatever university you name, is what you'll give to the student radicals. And what, on the other hand, can't, even if you wanted to. And then to remember, please, the student radicals at the time wanted things that the presidents of the universities couldn't give in. They wanted the president of the university couldn't do anything to bring end the war in Vietnam. Literally, they could not bring socialism to the world. But student radicals in the '60s at a peak were more, what do I say, more radical than the workers of the '30s and the '40s. I'm speaking now about the sort of unionized members of the unions. I might add, these folks worked with Harry Bridges. They worked with the UE. They had no problem with the communists. Communists represented unions. They had to make negotiations and deals. What union people they had trouble with? You know who was? Al Schenker, Victor Gutbaum. These folks are crazy. They're unhinged. So I'm right about that. So, does that begin to answer?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I mean, they're just more about mediating conflict than they are about kind of a vision of society in a kind of ideological way. But obviously there's an ideology behind mediating conflict.
They believed it was possible to bring peace to the world. Not only in industry, the whole bloody world, including to overcome the conflicts between capitalism and communism. It's one small step at a time. That negotiations can bring peace. This way. They were doing this kind of work, before Schultz, before these folks were meeting with Soviet economists in the early '60s. Each year, they were meeting with communist economists from Hungary, from Yugoslavia, from East Germany. They thought it was that they could overcome conflicts between the capitalist and communist states. They had a vision of convergence between the two systems.
Right. So then how do you explain their sort of like failure to actually see what was coming down the pike for unions in the 1970s and 80s?
Good question. They were blind to what was around the corner. Think about it. For instance, the Cornell IR School, it was created because garment companies were exiting out of New York State, going to Pennsylvania, and then later to the South. They were sort of blind to that. And now the same thing is happening on a broader scale in industrial unions in the '60s and the '70s. And yet they were remarkably blind. These people seemed to know so much, and they did. Nobody knew. None of us even know as much as of those industries and those companies and those unions as they did. And yet they were blinded by their own mentality. Now, when I pressed Dunlop himself in his office, I said, "Wow, how can you not?" Well, Dunlop responds, "Well, what was the big unions back in the 19th century? What happened to cigar makers union? It's going to change. Yes, some of the unions that are strong now will dissipate, but new ones will come." And he, in fact, kept trying to do it into the very end of their lives. These were people who, every single one of the ones I'm talking about, worked to the very last days of their lives.
Sorry to interrupt, Ron, I'm sorry to interrupt, but if you can wrap up the answer to this question, we'll get to the last question on the board, and then we'll wrap it all up.
Toby, is there anything else that I didn't get to? So thank you.
Thank you, Ron.
I've got to talk to you later too.
Okay. And our last question is coming from Deborah. If you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. Are you still with us?
Yeah, I am. Hi. Okay. So my question is, I'd like to know the impact of the approach of the people that you're talking about, especially in their positions as high-level college administrators or college presidents. I'd like to know their impact on other college university administrators, because I know from research that I've done, college presidents seem to talk to one another.
Sure.
And I found in many of the college presidents an approach similar to yours. So what I'm trying to get at is that, is it a reflection, is this position that the men that you're looking at took, is it a reflection of their earlier experience? Or is it also a reflection of the time and the position of being college president and getting squeezed from lots of different ends that made them into sort of help them realize that the only way to approach anything was to negotiate and to.
No, I hear you. Thank you. Thank you. I believe that they were drawing on their own experiences. Now, at this point, 20, 30 years, at least 30 years of experience working with unions and management, and use those experiences and techniques, not only in their own unions, but as you rightly note, union presidents, excuse me, university presidents, university provosts, deans, all talk to each other. They learn from each other. The people I'm talking about were in the associations of these organizations, of these universities. You're familiar, I assume, with the Journal of Higher Education. That was just when it was created. So we can learn from each other. Kerr, after he was fired as president of the University of California, created a Carnegie Commission on higher education, which constructed enormous amount of research and published the research on how are we going to handle higher education in the future. So no, their work was they drew on their experiences in industry and employed it to try to improve, shape, and influence the future of education in the universities afterwards. And Schultz, Kerr was doing this in the last, even to the near end of his life. Sure.
So thank you, Ron.
Well, thank you.
We appreciate your being here, and I hope everybody enjoyed the talk as much as I did. And I want to remind everyone once again that these talks are brought to you by LAWCHA, the Labor and Working Class History Association. And if you are not already a member, please consider joining soon. And please also consider joining us on July 22nd when we host Alice L. Baumgartner, who's here to talk about her book, South of Freedom, Runaway Slaves to Mexico and the Road to the Civil War. And once again, thank everybody. I appreciate you.
Thank you for coming. And if anyone has questions, we're glad to talk. Email, glad to talk. Thank you. Thanks for coming.